Good evening or good afternoon to everyone who is today with us. I'm very glad that we are all gathered and that we will have this panel discussion. This is the fourth discussion in a series which is called LSE Ukraine series. This number discussion is focused on the most important issues in terms of modern Ukrainian history. We have already talked with prominent Ukrainian scholars and experts about development of foreign and defense policy of Ukraine starting from 1992 and up to now. What priorities did we have and what priorities will we have for the future? We talked about the developments on the military battlefield, and that was an extremely valuable discussion on the eve of Ukraine's counteroffensive activities. Just this Monday, we hold a discussion about Ukrainian economics during wartime. And this discussion is the last in a row, but to my opinion, maybe the most important one, because we will speak about Ukrainian society, Ukrainian people, the image of the victory, the compromises which are acceptable or not acceptable. So we will just explain actually to the foreign audience, how do we see as Ukrainian society, how do we see the future of our country, why do we so much insist on liberation of entire Ukrainian territory and not ready to make any territorial or political concessions in terms of our sovereignty to Russia. We will speak about Crimea because this is one of very critical issues, which is, to my opinion, underestimated by foreign audience and which is still discussed in the light of Russia shadow and Russian narratives about Crimea. And we will speak about justice, about documentation of the war crimes, the struggle to settle international tribunals for Russia for its war crimes and other types of the crimes Russia is committing. My name is Maria Zolkina. I'm research fellow at the International Relations Department at LSE. Ukrainian public knows me as the head of regional security and conflict studies at Ukrainian think tank Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And I am very happy to introduce outstanding speakers who agreed to join us today. So first of all, let me introduce Tamila Tasheva, who is the permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in Autonomous Republic of Crimea since 2022. Before that, Tamila since 2019 served as the Deputy Permanent Representative. At the beginning of temporary occupation of Crimea in 2014, she became a co-founder, and for long term, she was the head of Crimea Source, one of most famous and effective human rights organizations in Ukraine, which precisely dealt with issues caused by occupation of Crimea and effect on local population, both in Crimea and on the rest of Ukraine if people left Crimea and moved to the rest of Ukraine. Thank you for being with us today, Tamila. I am pleased to introduce Petro Burkovsky, who is, as of now, Executive Director at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. He is experienced scholar and public policy analyst, having an experience serving as the head of Center for Advanced Russia Studies at National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine. He authored a number of public policy reports and articles, and very well known as the person knowing a lot about Russia and Ukraine and bringing this expertise to international audience. Thank you for being with us, Petro. And last but not least, I'm happy to introduce Olga Ivazovska, the head of the board of civil network Opora, who is also well known in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, international expert in electoral methods and drafting the draft laws. Olga is also a co-founder since 2022 of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory and Center for War Crimes Documentation based in Warsaw. She was a director of national non-partisan observation missions in Ukraine, bringing together more than 25,000 of activists and observers involved in observation of electoral process in Ukraine. Thank you all for being with us today. And not to make this introduction even longer, I will pass the floor to Petro with very comprehensive, but at the same time, general and simple question. Petro, what does Ukrainian society thinks after 15 months into the large-scale invasion? What is the most important about public mood in Ukraine in the light of the conflict? Should foreign audience know and understand how our society has changed since the beginning of large-scale invasion? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for a kind introduction. We really today have good participants, and excellent participants, I would say, who can provide a good insight about Ukraine, about the issue of Crimea, about the issue of war crimes, and of course, all of us. I must admit it to begin with that all of us were and are representatives of the civil society. So it's very important from the very beginning to make a point that this war is not only the war of the state, that's the war of the society. And a lot of people joined this fight, and they joined it even before the full-scale invasion. They joined it in 2014, right after the Revolution of Dignity, and when Russia annexed Crimea, and when the war actually came to the Ukrainian soil. And why I mentioned the year of 2014, because at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, beginning from the 2014, we started to look into how society perceives the Russian threat, whether Russian methods of hybrid warfare, of division of the Ukrainian society, whether it's successful or not, and how Ukrainians are susceptible or vice versa, how they can resist these kind of different insidious techniques and sophisticated techniques which Russia employed to divide society and to weaken their will to defend. So let me just start the demonstration of the screen. I have 4 slides, and these are, first of all, do you see it right now?
Yes, yes, we do.
Good. So I have 4 slides, and these are 4 basic messages to the foreign audience. So the first slide, you can see it's about the compromises and willingness of the Ukrainians to make compromises. I just want to admit that this question we started to ask people since early 2015, when the Minsk Accords were signed, and when a so-called an action plan was put forward by the Normandy 4 format as a way out of the conflict. And since then, we asked the Ukrainians the question, are any compromises with Russia for the sake of the peace, whether these compromises are possible and acceptable? And we asked just the same question after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but we have a very different picture. So here you can see that the majority, the 2/3 of the Ukrainian society, that's a green line, they think that the war could end and can end only in the case of victory. In case of Ukrainian victory, of course, not the Russian victory. Before the full-scale invasion, majority of Ukrainian population thought that some compromises with Russia can be accepted. So right now we have a very different trend. Again, the main message that majority of the Ukrainians, they are not ready for any kind of compromises, whether it's a Korean ceasefire scenario or some other scenario which means leaving Crimea in the hands of Russia. No, majority of Ukrainians still think that the compromises cannot be made with Russia. So the next slide and the second message, and it's very important, how Ukrainians define the victory in the war. And here you can see 2 basic trends. first trend is again a green line, and you can see it's a little bit decreasing. And that's the opinion of the people who think that the victory means restoration of the state borders as of 1991. And there is the question, why this number is decreasing? For the very simple reason is that since the August of 2022 and until March 2023, the Ukrainian society is gradually radicalizing. So if in August 2022, only 21% of the people, of the respondents, they said that the victory in the war means elimination of the Russian army and pushing for disintegration of Russia. But in March, this number is 31%. So this you can see both lines. These lines means that majority of the Ukrainian society, or 3/4 of the Ukrainian society, think that the victory is either restoration of the state borders of 1991 or elimination of the Russian army. So that means a complete, decisive victory of the Russia. But I think that what this slide is about and what these figures are about, it's about that the Russian atrocities and the Russian constant threats to use some unconventional forms of the warfare, like destroying a critical infrastructure, like making mass killings and tortures of the people, like the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which happened just recently. This all only radicalizes Ukrainians, and that means that there is no window for any kind of compromises. And by the way, if we speak about Crimea, so the trend is downward, that in August 2022, almost 9% of Ukrainians think that it's possible to give up Crimea for the sake of peace. But right now, this number is below of the 5%. So, and now it comes to the third message. So we know very well, and society knows very well, that Ukraine can withstand Russia and can fight Russia because Ukraine is provided with the military and economic assistance from the West. So we decided to ask the people what the Ukrainian government should do if the Western countries, if the Western governments reduce or stop providing aid. And here you see that half of population, they think that, and they are saying that the government should continue its struggle and should continue fighting Russia no matter what. Another almost 15%, they said that maybe we should think about freezing the conflict, but without accepting any Russian conditions. And only 11%, they are saying that maybe it's a time, if the West stops military aid and economic aid to Ukraine, maybe it's time to start negotiations with Russia and maybe accept certain concessions on behalf of Ukraine. But it's only 1/10 of the Ukrainian society. And finally, and I will wrap it up with that, the final point. So a critical external observer can say, okay, all right, you're saying that you are not ready for the compromises and you think you can continue struggle, but what it takes for you, and are you ready for the sacrifices to continue this fighting? And the answer as of February this year was yes. Ukrainians understand the price of this fight, and they are determined to contribute to this fight. And you can see here how the people answered the questions, how they see their own role in repelling Russian aggression. So majority, almost 59% of the people, they said that they will provide non-military assistance as much as possible, including the volunteer activity or some other activity to support the armed forces. Already 3% of respondents, they almost 3% of respondents, they are already serving in the armed forces of Ukraine. and another 18%, and it's a huge, really huge number, another 18%, they said that they are ready to join the armed forces, territorial defense forces, or the volunteer forces to fight Russians in the front line. So as you see, we have almost 59% of the people who are ready to resist in the rear, and you have almost 21% of the people who are ready, who are fighting and who are ready to take arms and to join the army. And the message and the conclusion of this is that Ukrainian army is really knows what it takes for the victory and is ready to invest as much as possible, invest as many efforts as possible to win this war.
Thank you, Petro. Thank you. I think it was a great start to and sum up of all these months of the war. And it's very important that you made a reference towards previous 8 years before Russia invaded on a large scale, because unfortunately, Ukrainians still have to explain that the war started not just in February 2022, and we had to deal with Russia for 8 years before that. And now it will be very logical to pass the floor to Tamila Tasheva, who has very specific role now in, let's say, in the state system, in authorities of Ukraine, representing the president of Ukraine to occupied Crimea Peninsula, dealing with all the issues which were, accumulated since 2014. Tamila, why Crimea is so crucial for the victory of Ukraine in this war, and why basically it is so important militarily, from humanitarian point of view, from security point of view, not to decrease the significance of Crimea issue when we think about future peace.
Thank you, Maria, and it's honor for speaker this distinguished event. Actually, really, the Russian invasion did not begin last year, and it began at late February 2014 with the occupation of Crimea. The leaders of Ukraine have repeatedly said this, and I also want to emphasize that this war, which began in Crimea, must end there. We cannot talk about any territorial consequences because one of our main values is our citizens, and we will fight for every piece of our land and, of course, for every Ukrainian on it. Those theses are not just words for us. They are backed up by solid actions, first and foremost by the president of
Some problems with internet, I think that.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, fine, we can hear you, but I still don't see you.
You don't see me? Now also you don't see me yet?
No, I don't see. I don't see you.
Because my camera is on, but if you hear me,
yeah, now it's fine. Now it's fine. Yes.
Yes.
Fine. We can both see and hear you. It's fine.
Yes, thank you. And actually, those statistics are not just words for us. They are backed up by solid action from our President Zelensky and entire leadership of the state, both internally, internationally, and domestically. As a state, we are already prepared for the deoccupation of Crimea, and we have developed a framework roadmap, including the priority step of the state after the deoccupation of Crimea and the Crimea recovery strategy after the occupation, and are now actively working on the best possible implementation of those concepts. Thus, the mission, together with the partners, is working to create a personal reserve for the restoration of public authorities in Crimea. In Crimea, Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine adopted a decree about it. In cooperation with some academia centers in Kiev, we developed 2 academia master programs in public administration, and now we work on another programs which include issue of include issue of restoration of public authorities in Crimea. The president has also recently approved the composition of the advisory council on the deoccupation of Crimea and Sevastopol, which acts as advisory platform for the development and coordination of state decision on the deoccupation and reintegration. Besides that, in early April this year, President launched the tradition of iftar at the official level and at official level, and together with Ukrainian Muslim soldiers, leaders of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people and representative of the Muslim community took part in the iftar dinner, which is held during the holy month of Ramadan. Also, on May this year, the president of Ukraine met with the leaders of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people and with some Muslim soldiers, and are now who now really heroically defending Ukraine independency in the hottest spot, dedicated to the Day of Remembrance of the victims of the Crimean Tatar genocide. And actually, during these both meetings, the president reiterated that Crimea must be returned to Ukrainian control. This again shows that Crimea, as well as other temporarily occupied territories, are extremely important for Ukraine, and for this reason, the patterns of state governance are being changed, and attitude toward indigenous people and national communities are being rethought. Ukraine's approach to Crimea is fundamentally different from that of the Russian Federation. For 10 years, Russia has perceived Crimea only as a raw material appendage from which to extract resources and create a springboard for a large-scale invasion, with absolutely no concern for consequences. By destroying this Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, the occupiers endangered the lives of residents of the occupied territories in southern part of Ukraine, and dehydrated Crimea, not to mention the long-term consequences. During the entire period of the temporary occupation of Crimea, the Russians and the occupation administration accused Ukraine of ecocide, even wanted to file an application to the International Criminal Court regarding to Ukrainians' failure to supply water to Crimea, and now they have so easily abandoned this water supply, destroying everything around. Another striking example of Russian imperialistic and aggressive policy, its treatment of the indigenous people living in Crimea, in particular, of course, Crimean Tatar. Despite its seeming diversity and tolerance of other culture, Russia is engaged in mass repression and ethnic cleaning of peninsula. If we talk about the last year when full-scale invasion is started, we have at least 55 new cases of politically motivated persecution against Ukrainians. Currently, the mission is aware of 181 political prisoners, and 117 of whom are Crimean Tatars. Education in the Crimean Tatar language and Ukrainian language has been reduced to a minimum. The leaders of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, the representative body of Crimean Tatars, and Majlis itself are banned in Russia. Mobilization processes targeted at Crimean Tatars. For me, it's one question actually, what is this if not a repetition of the genocide of Crimean Tatar people, which was committed by both states, Russian Empire and Soviet Union Empire. We have no choice but to liberate our own land. Otherwise, nothing guarantees security. Ukrainians support this thesis, and actually today we hear it. According to the poll of the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, 84% of Ukrainians believe that no territorial consequences are acceptable, even if this makes the war last longer and create other threats. At the same time, having worked extensively with our international partners, we feel that Crimea is being treated in special way. Actually, of course, we see significant international support since 2014. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions to support the territorial integrity of Ukraine, condemned human rights violation in the temporarily occupied Crimea and the militarization of peninsula. Dozens of countries have supported the Crimean platform. Nevertheless, it seems that international community is shaping its perception of Crimea only based on Russian imperial narrative that have been imposed for centuries. Unfortunately, this causes obstacles on Ukrainian path to liberating Crimea and generates all those talks about red lines. Also, we see that nothing prohibits the occupiers from destroying our country without crossing the enemy so-called red lines. Crimea has already been under Russian occupation for 10 years, and we can see the results actually, and I described shortly it. Russia was not only satisfied with the very limited reaction of the international community to the occupation of Crimea, it went further and used Crimea for a full-scale invasion, making the peninsula uninhabitable. In conclusion, I would like to say that to talk about the public mood in the occupied Crimea, it is clear that we don't have so-called sociology in Crimea, but we believe that hundreds of anti-war and pro-Ukrainian actions that have taken place since 2014 and especially it intensified after a full-scale invasion testify to the fact that Crimea is waiting for liberation. Despite criminal proceedings, fines, and administrative arrests, Crimeans are still protesting and speak out louder and louder about the return of Ukraine. And for me, for a person who worked with Crimea issue from very beginning, and actually it's really very important. I thank you. Thanks again for invitation, and I am happy to answer your question if you have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamila. I will definitely come back to you with further questions, and I hope that those people who join will also put a question using this unique opportunity. Thank you for this comprehensive picture of what's going on in and around Crimea itself and the problem of perception of Crimea as well. Now I would like to give the floor to Olga Ivazovska. Olga, you are well known. Before 2022, you were mainly focused on electoral issues and electoral observation missions, also both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. But since 2022, significant part of your work is actually on bringing Russia to international justice and documenting the war crimes which Russia is committing and other types of the crimes Russia and Russian army are committing on Ukrainian soil. I remember that last October at one of security forums, it was in Warsaw, one of German politicians at that time said that he was worried that Ukraine would need at some point to choose between peace and justice. The audience in Warsaw reacted like this was said in Kiev, because Poland understood very well that the peace without justice is impossible, it's illusion. Can you please tell us what mechanism does Ukraine use right now to bring Russia to justice? Are we any way closer to the idea of special international tribunals? If yes or no, why? What obstacles do we still face on this long road to the real sustainable peace, when the criminals, both on the upper level of authorities and up to the actually executors, will be brought to court and to justice?
Hello to everyone. Thank you, Maria, for inviting me. And I have to highlight that I didn't work just with elections, because it's very theoretical discussion why we change everything, our bias, our professional focuses after 24th of February. It wasn't true for 100%, because me and my colleagues were working with democracy and democratic reforms. And you know very well that Ukraine is democracy, and authoritarian regime invaded Ukraine because of that. First of all, because we are going to be a part, not just geographically, but according to other rules, standards, a part of Europe, Western world, and European Union. So during 2.5 years, I was participated in Minsk process as an expert in political subgroup. That's why war was very close to us all the time in professional landscape and dimension too. And it was deep discussions about constitutional so-called reform, decentralization, and elections in between Russia and Ukraine on uncontrolled territories, but these territories were under on effective control of Russia all the time. So now we have honest part of the war, stage of the war, because everyone who have eyes, head and brains can understand that war didn't start 24th of February, many years ago. And for Ukrainians, it was started centuries ago. And we had already genocide. And because of nobody was punished after the killing of more than 8 million Ukrainians through famine, it was possible to start again against Ukrainian political and ethnical nation. First of all, we are building our Ukrainian political nation, and Crimea and Crimean Tatars are a part of this nation. So this is a good news that we have an honest stage of the war without some gray zones in what is going on in between Ukraine and Russia now. And because of the capacity of civil society to monitor the process, and my organization worked with law enforcement bodies, how to investigate electoral crimes, trust me, there is no so big differences to gathering evidences, to talk with people who are eyewitnesses of the violations, and to documentize what you saw according to legislation. So nothing special. But we had to think about universal jurisdiction and how to punish not just soldiers, which rape Ukrainian children, women, adult people in Kievska Oblast, Kharkivska Oblast, Khersonska Oblast. It doesn't matter where it happened. But we have to punish high-level politicians in Russia and Russia as a state, because Moscow produced this horrible tragedy centuries by centuries with us as Ukrainian neighbors. And we are fighting for our independence according to international law, international rules, which were adopted, established after the Second World War. And we have a right to fight for our identity, for our rights, for independence and territorial integrity. That's why we started to documentize war crimes as evidence what Russia is doing with us, and we are trying to compare this stage with the previous historical pages. Nothing was changed because nobody was punished after the Second World War, when Stalin decided that Ukrainian nation doesn't have a right to have elite writers, poets, language, culture, and so on and so forth. It's about genocide, and this genocide was ongoing for centuries. So now or never, if Ukraine will not produce the solutions for justice and accountability for Russia and high-level politicians in Russia, and this responsibility will not be irreversible for them, we will have new wave of aggression against Ukraine, of course. Then Moldova will be occupied. Belarus is already occupied. Georgia is under the Russian effective control for sure. It's economical and political effective control for now. And there are many other new pages of aggression from Russian side. And that's why we're working with documentization, but we are promoting the idea to have a special ad hoc tribunal against high-level politicians in Russia. Because you know that ICC doesn't have jurisdiction on Russia. Unfortunately, ICC doesn't have practical tools to start investigation because of crime of aggression. And this is a problem of international institutions like UN, Security Council in UN, extra rights of Russia in Security Council in UN, and their partnership with China, and others not so good friends of Ukraine on this stage of fighting for its own democracy, independence, and territorial integrity. And we are speaking that we have to establish new mechanisms if the world doesn't have it in the 21st century. We have to establish what will help to stop aggression against others, which decided to be under international universal jurisdiction of international law. And we have to build coalition with those states, countries, and societies which will be ready to be a part of this brave coalition, because we doesn't have solutions for now. And under the Ukrainian jurisdiction and jurisdiction of ICC, we can promote the idea to investigate and develop all the cases about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, because there are evidences about children, about identity, which has connection with the wording, what doesn't mean genocide in UN statute and other documents. But for act of aggression, we need to establish new one, and it will it is ongoing process, because there is a huge group of countries which already working with this topic on the practical stage. Everyone stopped just discuss about ad hoc tribunal. You know that the coalition has already more than 33 countries, and UK is an active part of it. And it is practical discussion about statute norms, form of realization of establishment of this tribunal, and high-level politicians has to be punished, because it's about historical battle to stop aggression against smaller countries, neighbors, which doesn't have nuclear weapon for now. And this is very important to have it. But from our side, like representatives of civil society, we're already thinking how to prevent new war. Because war is very natural for human beings, for nations. And we had so many wars many centuries ago, in 20th century, 19th century, it doesn't matter. We are fighting as humanity between itself because we didn't have effective rules. Now it's a time to stop. After the Second World War, it was a gap of peace, but we need to understand that peace is a sustainable statute of humanity, and it's about 21st century. And when Russia will fail, it will be the last post-empire state in Europe. So we have to decolonize Europe for sure. And it's about internal processes in Russia too, not only in external battles. That's why Ukrainian civil society developed document, we name it Sustainable Peace Manifesto, Never Again 2. So because if we don't have sustainable peace after the Second World War, we have to produce new visions how to stop the war in Europe. And this document has different parts, pages, articles, but the half of it is about justice and accountability for irreversible aggression against others in the future. And another part, it's what has to be a strategy for new Russia. When this Russia will fail, we need to talk closely with our partners how the new Russia has to look like, not to be dangerous for the neighbors, partners, and others. And this is about internal processes in post-war Russia. But I don't have time to talk about that in details. I believe we will find opportunity to speak. But if I just one more minute, I have to back to surveys which was presented and moods in Ukrainian society. Do you remember what was the picture of the victory in March 2022? I remember it was like back to the roots, back to the borders of front lines before 23rd of February 2022. President said like that. Many Ukrainians thought like that. Let's back to the borders late February 2022. And it was a picture of victory. Then when Ukrainian army defend and liberated the territories, when Ukrainian bloody nation lost so many lives, the new picture of victory was looked like we have to back to the borders 1991 because we have such rights. The international legislation rules on our side, and we have to liberate Crimea because the war was started from Crimea and the war will end on the territory, liberated territory of Crimea, when Crimea will not be the militarized base for Russian army. And look what we heard from our colleague now. So it was about Russia. It's not enough just to liberate the territories. We have to reload Russia, and Russia has not to be dangerous for all of us. So as long war will ongoing, as more as higher expectations about picture of victory will be inside Ukrainian society and inside other societies which are supporting us, not only produce solidarity wars, but through taxpayers' money, through military tools and equipment, through gathering into the different coalitions like 10 coalition, the fighter jets coalition, now it's about NATO coalition, and so on and so forth. It's very visible trend. But the part of the victory is justice for sure, because it will produce sustainable peace.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you. The fact that you referred to the vision of how Russia and the relations with Russia should look like is really important for the victory of Ukraine. Thanks for that, because it really, especially behind the closed doors, you can really feel that many of the even best partners of Ukraine still lack a strategy on how to deal with Russia. So the current regime and current Russian society, which either silently or actively, it depends on different groups within the society, tolerates this aggression or participates in it openly. So this is the one story, and it seems to be not acceptable to make deals at least openly and like it was previously, to go to business as usual, like it was at some point, even after 2014. But on the other hand, there is really lack of understanding how to deal with this regime. And Russia is using actually this for its own benefits, creating their alternative, which might be worse than Putin. And this information campaign is really going on in many Western societies. And I think they're backed by, to some extent at least, they're backed, these fears by and organized, orchestrated by Russia itself. So basically, I wanted to return to Petro and to put him a question, ask him a question indirectly related to this idea. So actually, conventionally, Russia hasn't, militarily, conventionally, Russia hasn't reached any of its goals. And actually, even partial occupation of 4 Ukrainian regions is not only not enough for Russia itself and completely not acceptable for Ukraine, but this is temporary. And we all hope that all preparations Ukraine was doing for liberation of its territories, which are occupied by Russia, that all these preparations will be successful and counteroffensive will be successful. But having no strategic goals reached, how do you see what is still in possession of Russia as a state in terms of instruments? Because Russia will definitely try to prevent this scenario when it fails. For many in the West, it seems that Russia is playing the nuclear card. Do you agree with that? To what extent this nuclear blackmailing of societies, even not elites, but of societies in the West and in Ukraine, is really something which should make us all worried? And how Ukrainians react to these nuclear threats? Because sometimes when we say abroad that Ukrainians have decided that nuclear threats will not stop us from trying to liberate our territory, sometimes we are not believed that this is our real intention.
Thank you. Very good question. Thank you, Maria. So first, I think that there are 2 parts of this. First, regarding parts regarding our Western partners and the like, and the second regarding our society and Ukrainians and all of us. So first part, regarding the wild card of the nuclear, either it's a strategic weapon or a tactical nuclear weapon. And here I urge all the Western scholars and experts look back to the Soviet times and read very carefully the Soviet military doctrine, how the nuclear weapons are used. Because Russians did not invent, or they have not invented anything better. And they couldn't invent anything better because the means of delivery, and I mean the carriers of this nuclear triad, I mean the submarines, the land carriers, and the air carriers like tactical and strategic bombers, they remained the same. So Russia did not produce any kind of force generation of the tactical, even tactical bomber capable of carrying cruise missiles, capable of carrying the nuclear warheads. They made a kind of, they upgraded the Soviet type submarine, but these are the same submarines and the same types of weapons. So let us what the Soviet military doctrine says about the use of the nuclear arms. According to the Soviet doctrine and the latest its edition of the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, is that this type of weapon is used in the very beginning of the conflict and as a surprise, and it used for making breaches, strategic breaches, destroying the nuclear assets of the enemy which was NATO, and creating a tactical breaches and the very sophisticated and in fortifications in the Western Germany, in Western Germany first of all, and only after that they use the conventional weapons and pouring the hundreds of thousands of troops and armored columns inside Western Germany and France. Nobody nobody in the Soviet Union was going to use the nuclear weapon after a long war, a conventional war. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous for the reason that if the conventional war goes on, the economy is exhausted, the society is exhausted, and the enemy increases its intelligence on you, and he knows, the enemy knows where are you hiding your weapon. So there won't be a surprise of using these weapons. So first of all, this is a very important message to the West. If Russia hasn't used the nuclear weapons yet, it won't be using. And the second, a very strong argument is that the war in Ukraine showed that the conventional air defense, the conventional and the most modern weapons, air defense weapon systems, they're capable of shooting down up to 90% of all the Russian cruise missiles and even ballistic missiles. So actually, what Russia is left is only with the submarines, and submarines with the nuclear weapons is just the weapon of retaliation. It's not the weapon of attack. It's a weapon of retaliation carried by France, by Great Britain, and by Israel, and also of course, by the United States. So it's a weapon of retaliation. So what Russia can do with nuclear weapons, only retaliate if it's attacked by the nuclear weapon. So, and nobody is going to attack Russia with nuclear weapon in any foreseeable future. This is the first point. Second point regarding the Ukrainian society, we also are doing monitoring of the anxiety of the Ukrainian society.
Petro, can you repeat, please?
Yes.
Can you repeat it, because you disappeared, that we are doing measurements or something?
Yeah, yes, we are measuring the anxiety of the Ukrainian society. I cannot tell this the figures because that's confidential, but the trend what we are seeing is that since August last year and until March this year, actually the anxiety and the fear of nuclear attack is decreasing, and it's a reflection that Russia is losing the information war inside Ukraine. They're using this threat of nuclear warfare very actively, but people don't of the use of the nuclear weapon is a threat. And if this threat is credible, then you can win concessions from your enemy. But Ukrainian society did not believe that doesn't believe it's possible. So nuclear threat is not working. And it means that if the threat is not working, the actual use also won't work. Vice versa, the results would be quite the opposite, only the kind of consolidation of the Ukrainian society. And of course, Russia knows the consequences of the attack on Ukraine. It was war by
Petro, the sound is chunking. It's interrupted all the time. I don't know if you hear me. Okay. Okay, we will wait until Petro will connect, but I think that he actually formulates pretty well his both messages, especially for the Western audience. Because I think that any either official representative of Ukraine or any Ukrainian authoritative body or expert on any trip, conference, advocacy visits can hear these arguments, still can hear these arguments. Petro, you just disappeared at the very end, so basically, yeah, just at the very end. So maybe just one last question, one last sentence was not heard. But the final idea that we heard was that if Russia is losing both an informational space and conventionally, so Russia will not get anything, any advantage of the usage of nuclear weapons. Can you still hear us?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Tamila, when we think about the future, I think that one of the questions which is still not very clear to foreign audience is how Ukraine itself sees the future of Crimea. You have mentioned about several strategic documents, about the idea of personal reserve. Please elaborate a little bit, explain about that, because I'm pretty sure so people in academia and even in think tanks don't really know about this initiative of Ukraine. So why is it important and what does it mean actually? What approaches does Ukraine think or has already towards Russian citizens who came to Crimea and illegally settled down there after 2014? And also, the last maybe small question in this regard, Russian propaganda says and frightens Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars that all of them will be treated as collaborators, all of them will be persecuted by Ukraine as soon as Ukraine returns to peninsula. What really the message, what is the real message of Ukrainian state towards people who had to live under the occupation?
Thank you, Maria, for this question. Actually, for us, it's very clear that Russia propaganda is trying to intimidate our people in Crimea, what they do actually in 2014. And we actually really prepared the development of reintegration processes, our policy view for integration after the occupation of Crimea. And if I say briefly, actually we work on different issues. It's one of them. It's a resumption of the operation of public authorities in Crimea and human resources. What I mean mentioned actually before. Also, it's the issue of persecution issue which related to amnesty and illustration. Another issue which we're working on is verification of documents and court decision of the occupying institution. It's a property right, it's a humanitarian policy, it's actually citizenship, including the issue of Russian citizens who illegally came and stay in Crimea after 2014. It's a really very difficult question. And we understand that at one time, yes, maybe not today or tomorrow, but day after tomorrow, we deoccupy our territories, and we must be ready for all these processes. And Crimea, it's of course it's a difficult case because during 10 years of occupation, all Russian system, legal system, work in Crimea, yes, and for example, it's more than 1,200,000 court decisions were issued in Crimea. It's a lot of documents were issued in Crimea also, and we need to do some mechanism for verifying, for example, all these documents. And of course, now we're working on this issue. One of the issues which you actually mentioned in your question is issue of Russian citizens. Actually, we are already working on it, and we understand that we do a procedure of expulsion Russian citizens from Crimea. Actually, legal according to Ukrainian law and according to any law of any countries, actually, because if some resident, some foreign citizen actually came to some country and who do it not in a legal way, of course, he immediately expelled from this country to country from where he came to another country. Yes, and according to Ukrainian law, we have this procedure actually. During 10 years, 9.5 years of occupation, we have in Crimea more than 500,000 of Russian citizens who transferred from Russian Federation to Crimea, even more. It's a minimum 500,000 of people. Some experts say that it's up to 800,000 people. Of course, it's a lot of people. And of course, all these people stay in Crimea illegally. After their expulsion, we do a procedure at individual level for do some request for official Ukrainian state institution, for example, for state migration service, for have a resident permit at Ukrainian land in Crimea. It's official procedure, yes. Another issue, of course, it's you mentioned it. It's the issue of collaboration and persecution people who do some collaboration in temporary occupied territory with occupation administration. Actually, the main message for our people that if you are ordinary Ukrainian citizen who live in temporary occupied territory, you have nothing to fear, because we will not persecute them for the fact of their residence in Crimea. We, of course, persecute, according to Ukrainian law, only the top official and managers of occupying administration, those who, for example, judges, for example, prosecutors, investigators, police officers, another persons who work in law enforcement bodies in occupied administration, because they actually persecute our people in Crimea who committed war crimes and other serious crimes under international law, who do, for example, a propaganda. Of course, we will be brought all these persons to responsibility. But if you ordinary Crimean, even if you have a Russian illegal passport, because according to Ukrainian law, we do not recognize all these documents as a crime, actually, if you have a Russian passport. But if you ordinary Ukrainian citizen who live at this territory, you have nothing to fear. Of course, Ukrainian authorities do not persecute only on the fact that you live in occupied Crimea.
Thank you, Tamila. I think it was extremely important because there are a lot of speculations about how Ukraine will build up its policy towards Crimea, towards Donbass, and there is another, even not a speculation, but maybe, in my opinion, just mistake or wrong assumption And now I will refer to Olga, who has, I think, the best capacity to answer this question. Yes, exactly because of your experience of working in a political working group of Minsk Trilateral Contact Group, this was actually the most active platform where Ukrainian side tried to have constructive negotiations with Russia for 8 years. For implementation of Minsk agreements. And actually, this is the best example why and how it failed. And having this experience behind us, I think we can explain to many of those scholars and experts and politicians abroad who think that to some extent, the political settlement or negotiations with territories still occupied is acceptable. Because if you do not go for the entire liberation of Ukrainian territories, it means that you go for political settlement and start negotiations, something similar to Normandy format or to the Minsk, which was the working mechanisms for the Normandy format. So can you briefly explain why this assumption is far from reality, and that this kind of negotiations or approach was already used? And unfortunately, with current Russia, it completely failed then and most probably will fail now.
Thank you, Maria, for this question. And I want to start from the experience and expertise of UK. I learned a lot from Northern Ireland conflict. So I visited Northern Ireland, Dublin and Belfast and London in 2016. I know the history of this conflict. Of course, it has some historical roots. But what I learned about negotiations from this conflict, that there are 4 T, which are very important for successful negotiations. First of all, it's truth between sides, it's trust between sides, it's talk. So negotiations are important as a track for sure, and time, because sometimes it's very difficult to accept that you are ready to accept some compromises because you need peace. So, and we didn't have at all in Minsk and Normandy format, because Minsk is just tactical level. Normandy format was leadership level, and it has to be in history because it's about truth. So we didn't have a truce between sides because Russia didn't accept that it's a part of conflict. They usually use wording that we are moderators as OSCE. We are observers in the process. We can't accept any responsibility because we are not a part of the conflict. So it's the first stage of negotiation. If you don't have trustful position of the sides, you will not have success at the end. What Russia took into account what Russia accepted as its own responsibility from Minsk protocols, nothing. And you can continue negotiate with the puppets or with dolls or actors, but it will not work because you have to talk with those which accepted responsibility and took responsibility to do something at the end. And it's about trust too, because if you did something according to the previous protocols, or not official legally agreements, but protocols, you have to moving forward through this track. And what Russia has to accept as responsibility to go out to win the territory of Ukraine with its own army, soldiers, those who we are leading the process of occupation of Donbas, and from the first stage Crimea. Do you remember this wording from President Putin and his press secretary, speakers, and other high-level politicians in Russia, that no, we didn't do anything in Crimea, and then yes, it was us. So if you can't produce any responsible position of the sides and trust and truth between them, you will not have anything. Ukraine adopted changes to the constitution during the first reading, and we lost 4 policemen near Verkhovna Rada of Ukrainian parliament. They were killed because of political position of society, that society didn't want to change a constitution according to the Russians' position. So Ukrainian state, parliament, politician accepted very high level, dangerous for those who are going to participate on elections next time, responsibility to do unpopular things. And you know that Russia said it's not enough, it was just a theater. Nobody can go out to the streets and fighting, because it's not about society, it's about external, I don't know, US hands or revolutions. It's not about society, it's about US. So if you can't even imagine that society has a power to say, no, we don't want to have Russian power as a state inside our country, you will not have any solutions. So, and my final words about that, Ukraine did many things, adopted unpopular decisions on the level of parliament, cabinet of minister. And if we try to compare the mood in the society about compromises during the last 8 years and now, you will see a huge changes, as I mentioned, from the territories, borders to back to the borders 1991, to have influence to change Russia, because Russia will be dangerous for neighbors all the time if the Putin's regime and next Putin's regime, because it doesn't matter what is the name of Russian president, will do the same. If the Russia will be authoritarian regime or totalitarian regime, it doesn't matter. Russia didn't have a history of democracy at all in 20th century, 21st century. So let's be honest, Russia doesn't have capacity to be democratic inside itself. That's why Russia will be dangerous for Ukraine and others for a longer period. So, and negotiations has to be at the end. When those who are on the good side, when those who accepted the international order, legal-based documents, and are living according to them, have to win. And then we can open the doors for negotiations about new order, about reparations, about how new Russian leadership will take into account war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, will give access to ICC or Ukrainian jurisdiction to those criminals who were killing Ukrainians for years, who destroying the cities and communities for 0 point. So my last point, that negotiation will be successful, but there is only one a very important rule, that each side has to have political will to negotiate. Now, Ukraine doesn't have this political will in society and on the level of leadership. But first of all, Russia can't negotiate because it will be the end in a real manner, not propaganda manner, because it will be the end of Putin's and KGB regime. Putin is just a leader of this regime, that's it. And you see I saw one question on our chat, so I will answer and then we'll stop my speech. So there is direct connection and direct connection between correlation. Sorry, it's late evening and I'm a little bit misusing of English language. There is correlation between level of violence against Ukrainians and level of resilience. According to philosophy of Russia, Putin, Moscow, and these criminals, if you are going to kill everyone, all of them will be ready to give what you want. But if you have the history of relationship with criminals, you have to understand that they will take everything what you have if you will not fight against them. And we are on the same close room with Russians, like Ukrainian society and Russian soldiers and Russian leadership and Russian state. What does it mean? The same for us. And if we will stop to fight, we will die. There is only one correlation. Increasing of violence between against Ukrainian will increase the resilience of Ukrainian. That's it.
Thank you, Olga. And actually, Petro, maybe you can also add some data, because this question directly asks about whether there are any data proving why and how Ukrainians reply with more resistance when Russia uses more violence. Maybe you can refer to one of last year's public opinion polls in frontline areas.
Yes, actually, we had we actually started the observations in May last year, the first one, in the areas that were not affected by the war directly. And our initial observations were that there is a real, as Olga said, there is a correlation between the level of violence, hostility, which Russia employs in Ukraine, and the will to defend, or will to resist, I will say. And we decided to test these hypotheses on a local level. We conducted surveys in two cities of Ukraine, the city of Zaporizhia and the city of Mykolaiv. Just to explain to the audience is that these cities were and Zaporizhia remains and Mykolaiv remains. These are frontline cities, and they were frontline cities for most of the last year. The Mykolaiv was shelled and bombarded on a daily basis. And we conducted we used the same questionnaire in both cities, and we compared them, and we also looked into the data on a nationwide survey, which we also conducted. So we did 3 surveys in July and August, so they can be compared. And the results, they supported the hypothesis that the more Ukrainians are pushed, the more defiant they become. And that was a kind of, I think, a surprise for the people in the West, because we should remember one very important statement or argument made by the people who try to push Ukraine toward negotiations. So the argument is that you lost so many people, and if fighting continues, you will lose even more. So maybe it's a time to stop and start negotiations in order to save lives. So actually that logic doesn't work, and that doesn't work in the Ukrainian society, because people see 2 things: that Russia uses violence regardless to the military goals, regardless to political goal. And it states very clear, and Russia is making a very clear message that the war will go until the extermination of or destruction of the Ukrainian statehood. So there is no reason to start negotiations, because the other side is not serious about the political goals. It's not about territory. It's not about the neutral status of Ukraine. It's about Ukrainian statehood. For Russians, it should be eliminated. And for Ukrainians, after they saw the fate of the people who left in the occupied territories, that they are killed, raped, tortured, deported to Russia. So they understood that there is no other option. There is no other option but to resist. And the more violence is used by Russia, then it means that we should respond in a manner. So we should become more stronger and more defiant in our fight. So that was the observation of the last year, and I don't think that changed a lot this year.
Thank you, Petro. And we have another very not similar, but question related to the public opinion research as well. If there is any information about public opinion in the occupied territories, yes, and how successful or unsuccessful is Putin propaganda there, I can just recall the couple of researches that Democratic Initiatives Foundation conducted in the period of temporary occupation of Donbas between 2014 and 2022. We insisted at that time that it wasn't possible to gather the valid data. So you could technically gather the data. And I think if any of even Ukrainian sociological companies would try to organize a public opinion poll in occupied territories, even the occupation authorities might welcome this, because they knew that regardless of what you gather, the people will not answer openly if they're living in a completely totalitarian situation there. So we used previously, and maybe we will, Petro can add, maybe Tamila will add something about Crimea. We try to measure the public opinion from using different methods. In Donbas, for instance, previously, we questioned people, we polled people at the checkpoints, those people who were moving constantly between occupied territories and government-controlled territories and Ukraine-controlled territories. They could answer more freely, and they were not scared of any consequences for that. We conducted qualitative research, conducting interviews and focus groups among those who have relatives and friends living behind the division line, so people continue to communicate. Petro, maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because I'm stepping in the role of the speaker. So how to measure the public opinion of people, or at least to catch some tendencies when we don't have the physical access to occupied territories?
I think that's a good question. I try to be very brief. So between 2014 and 2022, the conflict, let's say it was a low intensity conflict since May 2015 and until let's say the second half of 2021. So it was a low intensity. Since the second half of 2021, it was a preparation for the full-scale invasion, and the number of bombardments increased. But what I mean is that in the occupied territories, now we know, thanks to liberation of our territories, now we know what happens in the occupied territories. Abduction of the people, very aggressive interrogation with use of the extremely severe tortures and inhuman treatment of the people, humiliation. And everybody knows that your neighbor or somebody can report on you for any reason, maybe to take on you, to take your property, or to blackmail you, anything. So it's really difficult. And now we understand that all the polls, and I insist, all so-called surveys, quantitative surveys conducted in the occupied territories or districts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, they cannot be regarded at all as a surveys, because how you can survey people under the barrel of the gun, before the barrel of the gun? So it's impossible. And for us, it was a disaster to see how many scholars in the West, in Germany, in the United States, how they dare to use these kind of data, because it was not data at all, to argue that Ukrainians should how to say, should make an agreement with those who live in Donbass, and there should be some kind of process of rehabilitation or realignment, rapprochement, and so on and so on. And now we see that it's not possible. And right now, it's also not possible because people live under permanent threat of very, very dangerous treatment. It's not possible, full stop.
Thank you, Petro. Tamila, maybe you can make the last point in this regard.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Actually, I totally agree with Petro. In Crimea, temporarily occupied Crimea, is the absolutely same situation. Of course, this territory is under control of Russia from very beginning, and it's the effective control of Russian Federation of this territory. But it's actually really territory of fear, where Russian persecute Ukrainian, Crimean Tatars. It's look like poles under the gun. Yes, guns. What we have in 2014, when so-called referendum is happened in Crimea, and the same situation during this 9.5 years of occupation. And maybe you remember this case when Vice News, it's American TV channel, they came to Crimea in February this year and do some like material, like a poll, and to speak with Crimeans. And we really understand that any person in Crimea don't speak openly at TV camera, yes, but maybe very important to say that in Crimea we really have a lot of resistance after full-scale invasion, actually, and we monitor situation in Crimea after 2022. And now we have in Crimea more than 400 cases of persecution of people because they do anti-war protest in Crimea. And they persecuted, according to Russian newly established legislation, it's a discrediting of Russian armed forces. And it's different people who resist in Crimea. And if we're thinking about this mood, yes, mood in Crimea, how it look like, and for my personal opinion, we really see how many people now resist, even more than they resist before full-scale invasion. Why they do it? Because now we have strong Ukrainian armed forces, and now we have a strong government, yes, presidential vertical, and we fight for our independence. And we don't have the same situation in Crimea in 2014. And many people ask me why many people do not resist against Russian occupation in 2014. Actually, they resist, and many people are resist, but they understand that they don't have behind of these people strong army and strong leadership, and it's a totally different situation in 2022, and it's the reason why people now resist in Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamila. I can confirm on my side, because I'm originally from Luhansk region, and I can confirm that the same mood, pretty optimistic, appeared among people who silently or sometimes not silently supported restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, because in 2022, despite of all atrocities and horrors of large-scale invasion, they saw the window of opportunity to go for territorial integrity of Ukraine to be restored, because basically Ukrainian society was seeing the way of integration with Crimea and occupied part of the Donbas through compromises. And Ukraine was doing a lot within 8 years to compromise or to find a constructive platform for compromises. So we were in favor mainly of diplomatic way to find out the solution for the conflict with Russia. And after 2022, we see only one way, which should be backed then by security guarantees, by membership of Ukraine in NATO, in the European Union, which is also supported by absolute majority of Ukrainians as of now. I think this was exhaustive and absolutely outstanding discussion. I really do hope that it will be in use of LSE community and beyond. Thank you so much for devoting your evening, because this is already 9 p.m. in Kyiv. Thank you for devoting your evening for this discussion. Tamila Tasheva, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine for Crimea, Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Olga Ivazovska, head of Civil Network Opora and co-founder of International Center for Ukrainian Victory, and Petro Burkovsky, executive director of Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thank you very much. We will promote the event on all the social media and YouTube, and I will share everything with the speakers, of course. Thank you very much, and thanks comes from our viewers as well. So,
Thank you.
Keep safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Bye.